Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this first session of the ML Practitioner Track at EdgeImpulse Imagine Innovators, and we're thrilled to have you and to kick the track with you today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Feel free to ask questions in the chat at any time during the presentation. We'll be monitoring the chat and we'll address your question as they come. But we also set aside some time at the end of for a Q&A session. So be sure to stick around for that. And most importantly, if you haven't already, we encourage you to sign up for EdgeImpulse. You can find the link in the chat or visit studio.edgeimpulse.com. This will allow you to create your own AGI models and apply what you have learned today. Now, let me introduce you to our speaker for this session, Brian. Brian is a staff developer relation engineer with EdgeImpulse. And Brian enables you, all the developers, to incorporate AGI into your real-world application by creating the technical content, delivering webinars, workshops, and most importantly, ensuring your feedback drives the product innovation. In prior roles, Brian has worked on everything from autonomous underwater vehicle, biotech innovation, to control systems and novel microscopy technology. At the heart of all of it, Brian loves turning complex technical ideas into something tangible. So Brian, thanks a lot for joining us today. We're excited to hear your insights on how to train novel architectures using custom learning blocks with EdgeImpulse. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Louis. Hi, everyone. As Louis mentioned, I am Brian McFadden. I'm a developer relations engineer at EdgeImpulse. And in today's session, I'm going to walk you through how to bring your own architectures, your own neural network architectures into the EdgeImpulse platform. And specifically, I'm going to show you how to do that by using custom learning blocks. The session today is kind of a two-part session, so I'll kick it off by providing a bit of background information, and then in the second half, I'll actually do a hands-on demo to show you how to create this custom learning block and bring it into the platform. Okay, so some motivation for the talk today is that within the EdgeImpulse platform, we do have pre-built architectures. So there's learning blocks for classification, regression, object detection, anomaly detection, and these are very effective and usually what I use to get started. But if you spent any time in machine learning, you know that new architectures are coming out every day, and maybe you want to try the latest architecture from a new research paper. Maybe you're developing your own architecture, you have something proprietary. So this talk is about how do you train those architectures within EdgeImpulse. And luckily, EdgeImpulse is extensible through the use of custom learning blocks. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. There are a couple prerequisites. So if you do want to follow along with the demo and build alongside me, you will need an EdgeImpulse account. So there's a QR code there on the left-hand side. If you don't have an account, now is a great time to sign up for one. It's super easy, only takes a minute. And then the second part is I will be using the EdgeImpulse CLI. If you don't have that installed right now, no worries. This session will be recorded and released at a later date. You can install it on your own, follow along at your own pace. And that is it. We're good to go. Okay, so moving on to a bit of background information. The first thing is, if you're not familiar with EdgeImpulse, you might not know what a learning block is. So what I'm showing in this slide is a screenshot of Studio, and Studio is our UI browser-based way to access the EdgeImpulse platform. And specifically, I'm showing the Create Impulse screen. So an impulse is the ML pipeline that would run on your edge device after being deployed. And it's broken down into a series of blocks. The red block is the input block, where you manipulate your input data slightly. The white block is a processing block to do feature extraction. And then the purple block is the learning block. In this case, it's a classification block. Then there is the output block, the green block. So what we're talking about today is this purple block and how to create your own. So creating your own learning block, we call them custom learning blocks. What they allow you to do is bring in your own architectures and training scripts into Edge Impulse, giving you a ton of flexibility and extensibility. And one cool thing about custom learning blocks is they are available to all users. So whether you're a paid enterprise user or you're on one of the free tiers, this is available to you. Now, this is slightly different than our other custom blocks, which are restricted to enterprise users only. And then the last thing I'll say is this overview is going to be quite quick. It's going to be high level. There are a ton of complex things you can do with custom learning blocks. So to support that, we do have extensive documentation. And I've shown a little snippet of that, a screenshot of it on the right-hand side here. You can find that at docs.edgeimpulse.com. Okay, to lay the foundation, I always think it's helpful to have a little bit of a visual of the structure. So I'm showing the structure of a custom learning block here, and it's essentially a wrapper that encapsulates a Docker image. So there's a few key files that you have to have for it to be a learning block. That is the parameters.json file, and that is where you define the parameters that get passed to your training script as arguments. There's the Docker file, which provides the instructions on how to build the Docker image. And then there are your learning scripts within the actual application that you run. Then also the file system is mounted into the learning block, and this gives you access to the data that's required for training. Now, the custom learning block interface is as shown on this slide. So on the left-hand side, you can see the inputs, and the inputs consist of command-line arguments. So those are the parameters that you define in your parameters.json file. They get passed into your script as command-line arguments. And then also passed in is the training data. And this is a directory of data with the training data already split into training and validation splits and after the processing block. So the feature extraction has already happened. There's also a sample ID details.json file in there that gives some more information about the samples if you need it. And in our documentation, there's further details about what is included in that file. For outputs, as long as your block outputs one of the main model files, you're good to go. So you can see you can output or export TF-late files, whether that is the intake quantized version or the float32 unquantized version, TensorFlow save model format. If you're working with PyTorch, you can export an Onyx model. And if you're working with scikit-learn, you can pickle that file and export the model as a pickled file. Okay, I mentioned that learning blocks, custom learning blocks, are available to both enterprise customers and free tier developers. What I want to point out is how you access these blocks once they have been pushed to Edge Impulse. So if you're an enterprise customer, you would go to your organization, and then on the left-hand side under the sidebar menu under custom blocks, there's the machine learning tab, which will take you to your custom learning blocks. If you were on a free tier, you would go to your developer profile, and at the top, there is a tab that says custom ML blocks. So you would select that, and this is where you would find the blocks for your personal account. All right, it's time to get hands-on and actually build something. So here are the 5 main steps that you need for a custom learning block. First, you have to create the block, then you would initialize it. You would do your testing locally to make sure you're happy with the performance of it. You then push the block to Edge Impulse, and then it's available to use in your project. So I will escape out of the slideshow, and I will get my desktop set up here to do a bit of a demo. The first thing I want to point out again is the documentation. I know I've mentioned it a few times, but it is a really great place to go to answer a lot of your more detailed questions. So the first thing I'll point out is I talked about the Edge Impulse CLI. So right here, if you click on the CLI, there's a document for installation. In terms of installation, there's instructions for both Windows machines and Linux machines. The next thing I'll point out is under the Edge Impulse Studio section, under the Organization Hub, there is the section for custom blocks. This first page does a great overview of the information that is generic to all the different types of blocks we have, and then each type of block has its own specific page. So since we'll be looking at the learning blocks, I'll open up that page. Okay, the first step is to create the block, and rather than creating the directory structure from scratch and creating the files from scratch, what I'm going to do is go to the Edge Impulse GitHub account. So that's github.com/edgeimpulse. And if I scroll down to the repositories here and I search for ml-block, you'll see a lot of pre-built examples. So I'll just go to all repositories here. So looking at all the repos, there's an example for YOLO v5. That's pretty common to bring that back into the platform. If you're working with PyTorch, there's a template for getting started with PyTorch. There's a template for getting started with Keras. A few other specific models are built out already as examples. And then there's also an example for scikit-learn. So that's the one I'm actually going to click into today. I'm looking at this one just because it is one of the simplest examples. Some of those other examples have scripts for installing CUDA and running some other shell scripts and that. But this one most reflects that learning block structure that I showed earlier in the diagram. So you can see we have our Docker file, we have our parameters.json file, we have our train.py file, which is the learning script. And then this one just has a couple other files like the license and the README and the requirements for Python installations. So what I'll do is I'm just going to go over to my terminal window here, and I'm going to clone that repo. And that is step one done. So I've created the block structure. I have that directory locally now. Oops. We'll get out of there. We'll go back to terminal, and I'll just list all the files. Actually, I need to change into the directory first. ML block kit. All right, then I'll list all the files. So you can see we've got all of our files locally here. So moving on to the next step is to initialize the block. And if you go back to our custom block documentation, go to the section developing custom block, the instructions are here for you to reference later. So we're going to use the CLI and use the blocks init command. And what this is going to do is two things. It's going to create the config file, which associates the block with a particular organization. And then if you don't have a existing parameters.json file in your directory, it will ask you some additional questions to help you create that file. So it'll ask the type of the block, the name of the block, the description, the type of data that it operates on. We already have our parameters.json file, so we won't see those questions when I initialize it. So I'll go into Edge Impulse blocks init. And if you haven't authenticated already, it will ask you for your username and password. I've already done that, so it jumps straight to the organization selection page. If you're an enterprise customer, you'll see your organization here in addition to your personal account. If you're on the free tier, I believe you'll just see your personal account. In my demo account here, I do have several organizations, so you can see I've got a few to select from. I am going to select the Edge Impulse Docs organization and add the block there. Then it's going to ask if I want to update an existing block in the org or create a new one. I'm going to create a new block. And that is the initialization done, but I'll just list all the files again. And now you can see we have that EI block config file. Actually, I'll open these up in code just so we can have a quick look. So the EI block config file, really simple file, just associating the block with a particular organization ID. The Docker file, this one is, again, a very simple Docker file. It's just installing the Python requirements and then setting the entry point when you run the container as the learning script. The parameters.json file talks about the type of the block here, the name. I'm actually going to change this so it's a little bit more clear when we push it to the platform in this example. So I will call it Imagine Innovators Learning Block. And then I'm going to update the description as well. And then I won't change the type of data or the GitHub link or anything else. The parameters, in this case, we just have one single parameter, the number of training epochs, the default value set to 1,000. This is what will get exposed in the UI when you go to train the block. So I'll save that file and I will close out of code. Now, the next step is to test the block locally. So I'm actually going to skip over that and I'll come back to it. I'm going to skip to push the block to Edge Impulse just because it takes a bit of time to run the job, build the container or build the image, push the image to the registry. So in order to push the block to Edge Impulse, again, it's in the documentation here. You can use the CLI to push. And there's also a note in terminal here of how to push the block. So I will follow that. So that is going to kick off a job to start building that image and pushing it to the registry and adding that learning block to your organization. And while that's running, I'll come back to testing. So obviously you want to test locally. It's a lot more efficient than pushing the block up to your organization every time you change something. There's three main ways to test. The first is you can test your scripts directly, just pass them any arguments they need. The second, you can test by building the Docker image locally and running the container directly, again, passing it any required arguments that you have. Or the third way is to use the blocks runner tool in Edge Impulse to test the complete block. Depending on the block that you're developing, there will be differences for the commands there. So if we scroll down to the learning block, testing the block locally, you can see some more information on how to test that with the blocks runner, the commands to enter as an example, and also it shows how to do that with Docker, the commands to build the container and run it. Okay, hopping back over to our terminal window here, it looks like the block has been pushed to Edge Impulse. So I'm going to go into my profile. So this is my developer profile in Studio. If you're on a free tier, this is where you will go to see your block. So at the top here under custom ML blocks. In this case, I didn't push it to my personal account, so it's not appearing here. However, I did push it to my Edge Impulse docs organization. So in the organization here, on the left-hand side, under machine learning, we go to that tab and we can see the Imagine Innovators learning block is now in this organization. So that is pushing it to the organization and it is ready to use in a project. So to use the block in a project, it's really simple. It's the exact same way as using a built-in block. So I'll go to projects here and I will open one of our tutorials and I will go to the Create Impulse page where the Impulse has some learning blocks already. In this case, there's a classification block and a anomaly detection block. So to use a custom block, so same as adding a built-in block, you click on Add Learning Block. And you can see in the list of blocks here, I have my Imagine Innovators Learning block that I just pushed. If you don't see your block here, there may be a mismatch between the type of data that your block operates on and the data on the project. In that case, you can look at show all blocks anyways, and it may be in the list of an incompatible data type block. Anyways, I'll shrink the list and I will go back to add that block. So you can see it in the list of blocks here. I will save the impulse. And then on the left-hand sidebar menu here, you can see the block is now there. And the parameters that we defined in our JSON file are exposed in the UI here. Number of training cycles with the default value of 1000. So from here, you would save and train, and everything operates as usual in your project. And you can now bring in any architecture you want. So I know this was a very quick overview of custom learning blocks. We looked at a really simple example. So if you do have some questions, I believe we have some extra time right now to handle those. If you're looking at this after the fact and developing on your own, a great place to get support is through the forum. So that's forum.edgeimpulse.com. And then if you are an enterprise user, you can reach out to your solutions engineer. And again, the last comment I have is our documentation is extensive, also a great place to get your questions answered. All right, thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to my session. We will now answer a few questions if there are any. Thanks so much.